August 10, 1943. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring sat in his command post outside Messina, reading the latest intelligence summary from Sicily. His forces were conducting a masterful fighting withdrawal across the Strait of Messina, exactly as planned. American casualties were mounting. The British were bogged down. And then, buried in an agent report from behind American lines, a detail that made Kesselring pause, General George Patton had struck an enlisted man in a field hospital. Kesselring underlined the passage twice. In the German army, such an incident would have been handled internally, quietly, with strict discipline maintained. But this was America. Their press was already investigating. Their Congress was asking questions. Kesselring passed the report to his intelligence officer with a single question penciled in the margin: "Can we exploit this?" What the German High Command couldn't know yet was that this incident wasn't about discipline at all. It was about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American military power, a contradiction that would decide the war. The Sicily campaign of July and August 1943 had revealed something troubling to German intelligence analysts. American forces, green and untested just months earlier in North Africa, were learning at an impossible rate. Their 7th Army, under Patton, had moved with a speed that contradicted every German assessment of American capability. In 38 days, Patton's forces had covered 200 miles of hostile terrain, captured 93,000 prisoners, and beaten the Germans and British to Messina. Major Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, intelligence officer for the German Civ Panzer Corps, had compiled detailed reports on American performance. The Americans were supposed to be soft, undisciplined, too comfortable to endure the brutal realities of combat. Yet here they were, moving faster than Rommel had in France, hitting harder than anticipated, adapting tactics within days instead of months. Von Mellenthin's assessment, dated August 5, 1943, noted with professional concern, "American commanders demonstrate unexpected aggression and tactical flexibility. Their logistical capability exceeds our previous estimates by a factor of 3. But then came the hospital incidents. On August 3 and August 10, 1943, Patton had physically struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The reports reached German intelligence within 72 hours. Here, finally, was evidence that matched their preconceptions. American generals were brutal, their enlisted men were breaking under pressure, their vaunted democracy was a fiction. They were reading the evidence completely wrong. The first soldier was Private Charles H. Kuhl, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. He had been hospitalized 4 times in 2 weeks, each time diagnosed with various physical ailments, finally ending up in the 15th Evacuation Hospital on August 3rd with a diagnosis of exhaustion, no wounds, no visible injuries. Patton, touring the hospital and seeing wounded men with shattered limbs and sucking chest wounds, encountered Kuhl sitting on a cot, fully dressed, apparently uninjured. What happened next took 11 seconds. Patton asked what was wrong. Kuhl replied, "I guess I can't take it." Patton's hand came up. He slapped Kuhl with his glove, called him a coward, grabbed him by the collar, dragged him toward the tent entrance, and kicked him in the rear. A medical officer intervened. Patton, shaking with rage, demanded the man be returned to the front lines immediately. He shouted that he wouldn't have cowards in his army crying when there were brave men dying. The medical staff was horrified. More importantly, they documented everything. Lieutenant Colonel Perrin H., Long medical inspector, filed a formal report that reached General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters within 5 days. 7 days later, on August 10th, Patton did it again. Private Paul G. Bennett, 17th Field Artillery Regiment, hospitalized at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, also showing no physical wounds. This time, Patton's reaction was worse. He slapped Bennett, drew his ivory-handled pistol, waved it in the man's face, and threatened to shoot him on the spot. He called Bennett a yellow-bellied bastard who was going back to the front to fight, although that's too good for you. Nurses pulled Patton away. Colonel Donald E. Currier, the hospital commander, filed an immediate report. For the German intelligence services monitoring American communications intercepts, this was a gift. Here was proof that American forces were breaking, that their celebrated general was unhinged, that the democratic facade was cracking under the pressure of real war. Kesselring's staff began drafting propaganda materials. The story would be leaked to neutral press, amplified through German networks, used to demoralize American forces and strengthen resistance among German troops facing the Americans. What they fundamentally misunderstood was that these incidents revealed not American weakness, but American strength, a strength rooted in something the Wehrmacht couldn't comprehend. Eisenhower received Colonel Currier's report on August 16, 1943. He read it twice, then locked it in his personal safe. For the next 48 hours, Eisenhower conducted what his staff would later describe as the most difficult investigation of his command. He interviewed medical officers, read psychiatric reports on combat fatigue, reviewed casualty statistics, and consulted with his chief surgeon, Major General Paul Hawley. The medical data was unambiguous. Combat fatigue, which the Germans dismissively called weak nerves and often treated as cowardice, was affecting both armies at similar rates. In the German army, soldiers showing symptoms were sometimes court-martialed, sometimes reassigned to penal battalions, sometimes quietly sent to rear areas and their records adjusted. The official doctrine, as outlined in Wehrmacht Training Manual H.DV 132A, stated that willpower overcomes psychological weakness. German psychiatrists who suggested otherwise faced professional consequences. The American approach, still evolving in 1943, was different. Brigadier General Frederick Hansen, Patton's own chief surgeon, had been implementing a forward treatment doctrine. Soldiers suffering psychological breakdown were treated close to the front lines, given rest, and returned to duty when able. The success rate was 65%. Men treated this way often returned to effective combat performance. The German system, by contrast, either lost these soldiers permanently or returned them to combat without treatment, where they typically broke down again within days. Private Kuhl's medical record told a story the Germans would never have documented. He had chronic diarrhea from field conditions, had been in continuous combat for 28 days, had survived an artillery barrage that killed 3 men in his foxhole, and was running a fever of 102.2 degrees when Patton struck him. The diagnosis of exhaustion was accurate. Modern medical understanding would classify his condition as acute stress reaction, a normal psychological response to abnormal stress. Private Bennett's story was even more revealing. He had served continuously since November 1942, had participated in 4 major engagements, and had broken down only after learning his best friend had been killed by friendly fire. A German soldier in Bennett's position might have been transferred quietly, or labelled a Malinger and sent to a punishment unit, or simply listed as a casualty and forgotten. The American system had admitted him to a hospital, documented his condition, and was preparing to treat him. Eisenhower spent hours reviewing these files because he was calculating something the German High Command hadn't considered: the true cost of different command philosophies. The German system appeared harder, more disciplined, more warrior-like. It also wasted soldiers at a rate the Wehrmacht could no longer afford. Germany's manpower pool was finite and shrinking. Every soldier lost to untreated psychological breakdown, every man shot for cowardice who might have recovered, every effective soldier dismissed as weak represented an irreplaceable loss. America's manpower advantage wasn't just numerical, it was systemic. The willingness to acknowledge that brave men could break, to treat them, to potentially return them to duty, meant that the American army could sustain higher loss rates while maintaining combat effectiveness. A German division reduced to 60% strength was often considered combat ineffective. American divisions routinely fought at 50% strength, constantly receiving replacements, many of them men who had broken once, been treated, and returned. On August 17th, Eisenhower made his decision. He drafted a letter to Patton that was simultaneously a reprimand and a calculation. He ordered Patton to apologize to both soldiers, to every medical officer present at both incidents, and to every division under his command. The apologies had to be face-to-face, personal, witnessed. Eisenhower wrote, "I am well aware of the necessity for hardness and toughness on the battlefield, but this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates." Then Eisenhower added a line that German intelligence, when they eventually intercepted the letter, found incomprehensible. "I assure you that conduct such as this will not be tolerated in this theatre, no matter who the offender may be." The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean was threatening to relieve his most successful combat general, the one German commanders feared most, over 2 slapping incidents. To the Wehrmacht's way of thinking, this was insanity. Kesselring, reading the intercepted letter, reportedly told his staff, "The Americans are more concerned with sentiment than victory." He was wrong. Eisenhower was concerned with sustaining an army across years of war, maintaining the moral authority necessary to keep American democracy committed to that war, and preserving the systematic advantages that came from treating soldiers as human beings rather than expendable assets. The story broke publicly on November 21, 1943, when radio commentator Drew Pearson revealed the incidents on his national broadcast. The American public's reaction was immediate and divided. Some demanded Patton's immediate dismissal. Others defended him as a warrior, doing what was necessary to maintain discipline. Letters flooded the War Department at a rate of 1,500 per day for 2 weeks. The U.S. Congress received over 4,000 letters demanding investigation. German propaganda seized the opportunity. Joseph Goebbels' ministry produced leaflets dropped over American positions showing Patton striking soldiers, with captions in English, "Is this what you're fighting for? Officers who beat their men?" Radio broadcasts from Berlin suggested that American forces were on the verge of mutiny, that Patton had been secretly relieved, that the incidents proved American decadence and military incompetence. In Washington, senior military officials and Roosevelt administration figures debated Patton's fate. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall received intelligence reports showing that German propaganda was having minimal effect on American troop morale, precisely because American soldiers knew the incidents were being investigated, knew that Patton had been forced to apologize, knew that the system had responded to misconduct even by a successful general. The crisis reached its peak in late November when Senator Robert Reynolds demanded a full Senate investigation. Eisenhower, now planning the Normandy invasion, faced a choice: sacrifice Patton to political pressure or defend his decision and risk his own position. Eisenhower chose to keep Patton, but not for the reasons German intelligence assumed. He kept Patton because the slapping incidents and their aftermath had actually demonstrated the strength of the American military system. Patton had been forced to apologize in person to soldiers he had struck, to medical officers he had berated, and to entire divisions he commanded. He had done so humiliatingly in front of thousands of witnesses. The apologies themselves became legendary. At the 1st Infantry Division Assembly on November 23, 1943, Patton stood before over 20,000 soldiers and admitted he had been wrong. He said the words explicitly, "I was wrong. I apologize." A German general in Patton's position would likely have resigned before uttering such words. The concept of a commanding general apologizing to enlisted men was so foreign to Wehrmacht doctrine that German intelligence analysts initially reported it as propaganda, a fiction designed to improve American morale. But it wasn't fiction. Patton apologized repeatedly over several weeks to multiple audiences, and something unexpected happened. His soldiers' respect for him deepened. They understood that he had been forced to acknowledge them as human beings, that the system had protected them even against a general's rage, that their lives and dignity mattered to the institution even when they didn't matter to an individual commander. Major Heinz Guderian Jr., son of the famous Panzer general, was captured in Italy in January 1944. During interrogation, he mentioned having read about the Patton incidents. The American intelligence officer asked what he thought. Guderian's response, recorded in the interrogation transcript, was revealing, "We thought it showed weakness in your command structure. Now, having been captured by your Third Army, I think it showed something else. Your soldiers fight harder because they know the system will protect them even from their generals. Our soldiers fight hard because they fear their generals more than they fear you." The statistical validation came over the following 18 months. American forces under Patton's command maintained remarkably consistent combat effectiveness despite having one of the highest battle fatality rates in Europe. Third Army, activated in France in August 1944, suffered over 137,000 casualties by war's end. Yet its combat effectiveness ratings never dropped below 80%, and it maintained an advance rate that exceeded even German expectations. German General Friedrich von Mellenthin, in his post-war memoir Panzer Battles, analyzed American performance with professional respect. What we failed to understand in 1943 was that American strength came not from avoiding problems, but from addressing them systematically. Their willingness to acknowledge combat fatigue, to treat it, to investigate even incidents involving their most successful commanders, created an army that could sustain losses we could not. The contrast with German handling of similar issues became stark by 1944. As Wehrmacht losses mounted and manpower shortages became critical, German policies toward combat fatigue hardened. Soldiers showing psychological symptoms were increasingly treated as deserters. On October 10, 1944, Hitler issued an order mandating that any soldier who claimed psychological inability to fight be shot immediately. The order's effects were documented in divisional records. German units began suffering catastrophic psychological breakdowns, with entire companies refusing orders, soldiers deliberately wounding themselves, and mass surrenders becoming common. The numbers were revealing. In Tunisia and Sicily, German forces had fought with remarkable tenacity despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender rates for German units in Sicily averaged 12% of engaged forces. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German surrender rates had climbed to 38%. In the final months of the war, German units were surrendering en masse despite Hitler's orders to fight to the death. American intelligence interrogations of prisoners revealed that many had witnessed comrades shot for showing cowardice, creating a climate where surrender to the Americans seemed safer than remaining with their own army. Meanwhile, the American psychiatric casualty system was proving its worth. Of the approximately 1 million American soldiers treated for combat fatigue during World War II, approximately 65% returned to some form of military duty. Many returned to frontline combat. The program's director, Brigadier General William Menninger, calculated that this approach had effectively added the equivalent of 15 divisions worth of manpower that would have been lost under more punitive systems. Post-war testimony from German officers consistently showed they had misread the Patton incident. General Siegfried Westphal, Kesselring's chief of staff, wrote in 1951, "We interpreted the Patton affair as evidence of American weakness and confusion. We failed to understand that a military system strong enough to discipline its most successful general for mistreating common soldiers possessed a structural advantage we could not match. We maintained discipline through fear. They maintained it through institutional integrity." The counterintuitive truth that emerged from the slapping incidents was this: the army that acknowledged human limits proved stronger than the army that denied them. Patton's rage had been rooted in an old-world belief that will alone could overcome any obstacle, that admitting vulnerability was weakness, that harsh discipline created fighting spirit. The Wehrmacht shared this philosophy. It failed them both. What Eisenhower understood, what the systematic investigation revealed, what the medical data proved, was that soldiers were not machines whose output increased under pressure without limit. They were human beings whose performance followed predictable patterns, who broke under sustained stress, who could recover with treatment, who fought harder when they believed their leadership valued their humanity. The legacy shaped American military doctrine permanently. By Korea, combat psychiatry was fully integrated into medical doctrine. By Vietnam, despite that war's many failures, psychiatric support for combat troops was standard. Modern military psychology, present in every American combat deployment, traces its acceptance directly to the crisis forced by two slapping incidents in Sicily. Patton kept his command, led Third Army across France with unprecedented speed, and became one of America's most celebrated generals. But the system that forced him to apologize, that protected two privates against a general's rage, that chose institutional integrity over expediency, that was the real victor of Sicily. The Germans, watching, analyzing, trying to exploit what they saw as weakness, never understood. They were witnessing the strength that would destroy them. Not the strength of individual warriors, but the strength of a system that treated those warriors as human beings worth protecting, even from themselves. The war wasn't decided by who had the hardest generals or the harshest discipline. It was decided by who had the sustainability to fight for years, maintaining morale and effectiveness through unimaginable losses. America's willingness to investigate, apologize, reform, to value individual dignity even in total war, proved to be not a weakness to exploit, but an advantage impossible to overcome.